In the podcast for today, I'd like to talk to you about AIDS. By now, everybody probably knows a little bit about AIDS, but today I would like to introduce you to how sociologists view AIDS and by applying the sociological perspective to AIDS as a disease. We will talk about the initial social construction of AIDS back in the 1980s and how this has had a lasting impact on the way we view and deal with AIDS today. Now, for many of you, AIDS is a medical problem. That is, AIDS is a serious disease that deserves attention by doctors and medical researchers. But there are many dimensions to any disease, including AIDS, that are not explicitly medical or biophysiological. And that's what we've been talking about last week and this week. It's the experience of illness. In fact, medical sociologists often focus on different diseases in their research because different diseases often tap into different social dimensions. So I personally study bipolar disorder, major depression, substance abuse, suicide, and other illnesses, and all of these can have very different social effects. In this podcast, I'm going to focus on the social dimensions of AIDS. But in order for us to do this, we need to talk a little bit more about the important distinction between disease and illness and make sure you understand that. Peter Conrad makes an important distinction, and he says that disease is understood best as a biophysiological phenomenon, a process or a state that affects the body. Now, given this definition, what is AIDS? AIDS is not really a single disease, but rather an infection caused by a virus, which opens up a person's vulnerability to a whole laundry list of other opportunistic infections. In contrast, illness has more to do with the social and psychological phenomena that surround a disease. Today, I want to focus on the social constructionist's perspective and the social construction of AIDS. Social constructionism is an important perspective in sociology. You may have already heard the term in an English or a history class. In many ways, sociologists use the perspective in similar ways as other disciplines, except that we apply it to the study of culture as well as human behavior and attitudes. While social constructionism can take many forms in sociology, the basic idea is that to understand any cultural product, you must examine it in the context of the social environment in which the product was created. Another way to think about this is to think about social constructionism as having three interrelated core ideas. First, in the course of everyday social interaction, people create both material and non-material cultural products which contribute to a shared understanding of social reality. In other words, in the process of interacting with other people, we negotiate the meanings of things. We negotiate our behaviors and even our feelings. And these shared meanings become our sort of internal blueprint of social structure. And this blueprint helps us make decisions about our behavior. And these are necessary in order for the social order to maintain. All of those explicit and implicit social norms and understandings about how we should interact with each other and about how society should be structured. And of course, this process is sometimes conscious and sometimes it's not. So one way to catch yourself in this process is next time you're in an argument with someone, stop arguing and think about what it is that you're fighting about. Chances are you're arguing about the definition or the meaning of a particular behavior, situation, or feeling. And this often comes up in romantic relationships, for example. How did one person interpret something that was said or done, and how can you all come to some kind of agreement about that? And remember that any resolution to a conflict is really only the point where all parties agree to settle on a shared understanding of the reality of that situation, even if it's only temporary. However, it's important to remember that all social interaction is preceded by interaction. Since human beings do not exist in a social and historical vacuum, the negotiated sort of realities that we settle on are fundamentally related to the cultural environment in which the negotiation process happened. In other words, the social constructionism of the past continues to be valid and to have an impact into the future. This contextually contingent nature means that many of our experiences involve reinforcing, maintaining, and sometimes modifying pre-existing social and cultural institutions. This leads to a second important part of the social constructionist perspective. Because both material and non-material cultural products are created in specific historical periods and sociocultural arrangements, the shape that the end products take is heavily influenced by these pre-existing beliefs, knowledge, and institutions. But not all cultural products become part of the larger culture, which leads to the third part of the social construction perspective. Over time, as cultural products are diffused throughout a group or a society, they begin to take on a life of their own, and they become institutionalized and part of the socio-cultural environment. This point suggests that as a cultural product becomes more widely shared throughout society, the original source is going to become obscured, and the product becomes a powerful social force in its own right, separate from the inventor and separate from the original negotiation. We can think about this in terms of obesity, right? So we discussed in the beginning of the semester how obesity and our views about obesity as a society are constructed through social interactions. If our idea of obesity as a society changes, the way that it changes is likely to be profoundly affected by this period of history where obesity is seen as this massive public health concern. Right? So in other words, the future of obesity as a cultural product is likely to be strongly affected by how that cultural product is constructed right now. In terms of the cultural products taking on a life of their own and being taken for granted, we have lots of taken for granted assumptions about obesity, and it's hard for us to remember as a society when obesity wasn't conceptualized as a pressing public health concern, even though we talked about in class that this really only came about in the late 1990s and 2000s. So despite that obesity as a cultural product has been socially constructed over the last decade or two, it wasn't always that way, but we take for granted that obesity is this horrible health problem. Okay, back to AIDS. Let's turn to AIDS and try to see how applying a social constructionist perspective can give us some new insight into AIDS. In order to do this, we have to, for a moment, suspend our current thinking about AIDS and try to see AIDS also as a cultural product, just like obesity. So when and where did the cultural product, or the medical and scientific meanings of AIDS, emerge? To be able to uncover the moment and the circumstances that the first person actually thought up the idea of AIDS is probably impossible. We can, however, begin to get a sense of this process by looking at some of the published history. In late 1979, several doctors in the Los Angeles area began to talk to one another about several odd cases of pneumocystis carinii pneumonia and Kaposi sarcoma. Pneumocystis carinii pneumonia is a rare form of pneumonia that usually affects people with severely compromised immune functioning. Kaposi sarcoma is a rare form of cancer that until 1981 was most commonly found in older men in failing health. However, what made these cases seem especially strange was the fact that the characteristics of those who were afflicted were all very similar. These people were young, they were healthy, and they were sexually active male homosexuals. As these cases later came to the attention of the Centers for Disease Control, the CDC published an article in Morbidity and Mortality Weekly Report describing 5 cases of pneumocystis pneumonia in homosexual men. The article stated, in the period October 1980 to May 1981, 5 young men, all active homosexuals, were treated for biopsy-confirmed pneumocystis carinii pneumonia at 3 different hospitals in Los Angeles, California. 2 of the patients died. The report went on to describe the 5 patients' case histories. The editorial note that follows the article added that pneumocystis carinii pneumonia in the United States is almost exclusively limited to severely immunosuppressed patients. The occurrence of pneumocystis in these 5 previously healthy individuals without clinically apparent underlying immunodeficiency is unusual. The fact that these patients were all homosexuals suggests an association between some aspect of a homosexual lifestyle or disease acquired through sexual contact and pneumocystis in this population. On July 3, 1981, the lead article in Morbidity and Mortality Weekly Report was entitled Kaposi's Sarcoma and Pneumocystis Pneumonia Among Homosexual Men, New York City and California. In it, the CDC reviewed a variety of clinical characteristics and also reported on several more cases of pneumocystis and 3 new cases of herpes associated with similar immune problems. The last sentence warned physicians to look for these diseases and other diseases associated with immunosuppression in homosexual men. Having documented a connection in the scientific literature between male homosexuality with severe immunodeficiency, names about this disease began to fly. It was called gay pneumonia, gay cancer, and WOGS, W-O-G-S, the Wrath of God syndrome. However, eventually healthcare officials involved in the treatment of gay men began to refer to the disease provisionally as GRID, G-R-I-D, gay-related immunodeficiency. After its report in July, the CDC was silent on the developing epidemic until 1982, when it reported several cases of heterosexual hemophiliacs who had developed pneumocystis carinii pneumonia and similar indications of cellular immune deficiency. A major conclusion of this report was the identification of blood products as being an avenue of transmission. However, by the end of 1982, the CDC had taken 3 very important steps in the developing crisis. The first of these was that they created a task force on Kaposi's sarcoma and opportunistic infections, headed by James Curran. This group later became the hub of the AIDS activity at the CDC and the first federal organization devoted to studying the AIDS epidemic. Second, the CDC also officially concluded that AIDS was a separate clinical entity and settled on the label Acquired Immune Deficiency Syndrome. And third, they identified 4 groups of people who appeared to be at the greatest risk of getting the disease. These risk groups were homosexual men, intravenous drug abusers, Haitians who recently entered the United States, and hemophiliacs. By 1983, the sexual partners of these groups of people were also added to this list. This history of AIDS or HIV infection is really only a brief history of all of the labels and meanings associated with AIDS by the CDC. You could easily examine other situations, other communities that have shaped the meaning of HIV and AIDS, and you would see variation across these. However, this particular history is especially important in that it has clearly been the most widely publicized construction of AIDS in the United States. Now, let's turn to the impact of this construction. This brief overview of the first few years of the AIDS epidemic may sound familiar to some of you, and it may be completely unfamiliar to others. However, what's important is that the social constructionist perspective suggests that much of the cultural meaning surrounding AIDS as a cultural product are the result of the events that I just described. In fact, by the end of 1982, the CDC had not only officially labeled the new disease, but had also taken steps to create a bureaucratic institution to monitor and study the new disease. So no longer was AIDS simply something that people were talking about, it was officially recognized by an important and powerful institution within our government. But in addition to officially recognizing AIDS, the CDC also institutionalized many of the cultural beliefs about AIDS. By defining the official risk groups as including male homosexuals, intravenous drug users, Haitians, hemophiliacs, and their sexual partners as being at high risk for AIDS, the CDC officially sanctioned a set of social meanings about the disease as well. In other words, the identification of risk groups placed AIDS and HIV infection into a set of pre-existing social relationships, or pre-existing ways that we think about those risk groups, including gay men. This means that many of our individual and societal responses to AIDS are the result of this initial construction. Peter Conrad, in an article called The Social Meaning of AIDS, argues that AIDS is a triple stigma. Let's talk about why that is, because it's related to this initial construction of AIDS that I just talked about. So first, AIDS is a triple stigma because it's connected with stigmatized groups. Because AIDS was first identified with homosexual men and drug abusers, responsibility for having AIDS was quickly attributed to their deviant behavior or marginalized status. Peter Conrad suggests that one important effect of AIDS being associated with these marginal and deviant groups has been to make it easier to separate ourselves from the people who have the disease and indirectly from the disease itself. So in other words, AIDS has this unique us versus them aspect. One important way that people generate a sense of distance is by blaming the victim of the disease. We see this with mental illness as well. Thus, many of the most effective distancing mechanisms attribute the cause of getting the disease to specific deviant behaviors, like homosexual behavior or IV drug use. Other explanations that have a similar effect have been to see AIDS as being the result of social and moral decay in American society, or as the direct punishment of God for our sins. You see this when those ministers run around with those signs that say things like God hates fags, AIDS kills fags dead, etc. But a critical examination of the social construction of AIDS suggests that these attitudes are really just an outgrowth of our own scientific construction of AIDS. For example, if we look at the modes of transmission of HIV and AIDS from a worldwide perspective, it's clear that HIV/AIDS is not necessarily a disease of deviance. In Africa, for example, HIV is being spread primarily through heterosexual sexual contact, and the ratio of male to female cases is much more balanced than in the United States. Okay, the third aspect of HIV/AIDS that led Peter Conrad to call it a triple stigma is that it's sexually transmitted. Conrad also suggests that our reactions to AIDS are fundamentally linked to our attitudes about sexuality more generally. In fact, there is a considerable body of research which suggests that people who hold more erotophilic or sex-positive attitudes are more likely to be better informed about sexually transmitted diseases, including AIDS. And those people who have positive or progressive sexual attitudes are also more likely to take precautions against getting STDs, and they have more satisfying sex lives more generally than people who are more erotophobic or sex negative. We can even see evidence of the importance of sexual attitudes in the responses of different societies to AIDS. In many European nations, for example, where sexuality is more open and characterized by more sex-positive values, the societal response to AIDS have been very different, even though it's still also statistically primarily a gay disease. For example, in Great Britain, the government was explicit very early in the epidemic that AIDS was not going to be seen as the gay plague, and public health officials designed programs that encouraged all people to change their sexual habits to protect themselves. In other words, publicity was not targeted towards gay men like it was in the United States. In support of these values, they launched one of the most comprehensive and explicit sex education programs in Europe. In France, public health officials have designed many explicit commercials aimed at preventing the spread of disease in all sexually active groups. In one commercial, they depict two gay men on a beach getting ready to have sex. The punchline happens when they discover that they don't have a condom, and they decide that they would go and find one first. In another commercial, a mother and a father are depicted giving their son a box of condoms for his birthday. The concluding caution is that the greatest gift parents can give their children is advice and help with preventing AIDS. So you can see that they take a much more open view of what causes AIDS and how to prevent the spread of AIDS. In the United States, because of our sex-negative value system, Discussions about AIDS have minimized the sexual component. For example, many cities and states have mandated that educators discuss AIDS in the classroom, but at the same time forbid them from discussing sexual behavior explicitly. Seems ridiculous, doesn't it? Ads for condoms were tried early in the 1980s but were quickly taken off the air because of their, quote, offensive nature. And recently the CDC and the Department of Health and Human Services have been successful in getting condom promotion spots on national TV. Condom advertisers, however, have had more difficulty and have been systematically unable to buy television time on the major TV networks. Recently, they've been dealing directly with local TV stations, and a handful of stations in major urban areas have been more receptive to consumer advertising for condom use. Okay, and the final thing about HIV/AIDS that led Peter Conrad to say that it has a triple stigma is that it's a terminal wasting disease. To understand this, we have to understand that as a rule, illness is a regular and normal part of American culture. However, being sick is also a culturally defined, meaningful social role. It involves a specific set of social expectations or assumptions. So an ill person is supposed to have no control over being ill. They are often exempted from their normal role expectations. They don't like being ill, and they need to attempt to seek help. While most contemporary medical sociologists agree that this model doesn't describe all illness behavior, they do agree that it highlights American cultural expectations of those who are sick. Even from this cultural description, people who acquire the HIV virus don't clearly fit into our culturally defined notions of what it means to be sick. For example, because HIV is sexually transmitted and theoretically is preventable, having HIV/AIDS may violate the expectation that you have no control over becoming ill. Also, because people with HIV can live for very long periods of time with the virus before becoming seriously ill, people with HIV/AIDS may not act sick, and they may actually be able to carry out their normal role expectations for quite a long time. Also, the cyclical nature of the disorder violates our cultural assumptions that illness is something that comes and then leaves after you recover with appropriate treatment. Instead, HIV/AIDS comes and goes. So in these regards, not only does AIDS and HIV affect people who are deviants, but the course of the disease is inconsistent with American cultural understandings about disease in general. So what are the consequences of the triple stigma of AIDS? And what's the value of taking this kind of socio-historical perspective? If we apply the social constructionist perspective to the study of AIDS, we are left with the question, what impact are the early medical and scientific definitions of AIDS having on our individual and societal responses to AIDS? Since we don't have time to explore each of the three dimensions I mentioned, the three dimensions of stigma, today I want to focus on the consequences of the definition of AIDS as a gay male disease. This has had profound impacts on the way that AIDS has affected our society and some of the challenges of dealing with AIDS from a public health perspective. The first is in the area of education. As many public health officials regularly remind us, AIDS is a scary and deadly disease, but it is not an easily communicable disease, and it is preventable. However, in order for people to take precautions, public health educators believe that people must be willing to learn about AIDS and to take appropriate precautions. The initial association of HIV/AIDS with deviant social groups has made the spread of safe sex techniques and accurate information about AIDS very difficult. Two groups that have been especially vulnerable to this definition have been blacks and women. This is evidenced in recent statistics which suggest that the number of new cases among heterosexuals across all social categories continue to increase, while among gay and bisexual men, the number of new cases has begun to level off. So let's first talk about African Americans. So African Americans and other minorities are disproportionately likely to get HIV and AIDS. Statistics published by the CDC indicate that the number of diagnoses among African Americans now equals the number of cases among white Americans, and a variety of factors are believed to be contributing to this trend. These include poverty and less access to health care and health education, greater skepticism regarding the healthcare system, and in particular skepticism towards doctors, fears of increased racial discrimination among those who might have HIV/AIDS, and finally more conservative attitudes than whites about sexuality in general and homosexuality in particular. Now, several of those we've already talked about in this class and should be familiar. In one very detailed study of the Black response to AIDS, Quimby and Friedman highlight that these factors make a unified African American community response to AIDS very difficult, if not impossible. According to their analysis, many leaders of the Black community have been reticent to speak out because of traditional and strict Christian religious values which condemn many of the behaviors through which AIDS is transmitted. Still, others have been fearful of focusing too much attention on the issue out of a fear that would increase racial discrimination. Finally, because many gay and lesbian organizations have not consistently been supportive of Black or minority political concerns, many Black leaders are suspicious of gay and lesbian activists. Quimby and Friedman argue that these factors have made it difficult for the very active anti-establishment gay activist groups and Black organizations to work together successfully to mobilize political pressure and to organize educational programs and other services of mutual benefit to both of these communities. Okay, the other group that has been affected by the initial definition of AIDS as a gay male disease has been women. In fact, in its review of the first decade of the American experience with AIDS, the CDC reported that while men still represented the vast majority of current AIDS cases, the reported cases associated with heterosexual transmission of HIV have been increasing steadily, with cases occurring more frequently among women than among men. At the most basic level, several behaviors which have not widely been associated with women are contributing to the rising rates of transmission among women. The first is being an IV drug user. The second is having, either knowingly or unknowingly, bisexual partners who are also engaging in homosexual activities. And finally, having multiple sex partners. So women in particular have suffered from the initial definition of AIDS as a gay disease. While women in general are more liberal with regard to attitudes toward homosexuals than men, in the early years of the epidemic, women were seen only as tangentially at risk. In other words, they were seen as being at risk only insofar as they had connection to men who had connection to the gay community. Further, the images in many of the public health messages focused explicitly on men taking precautions and seldom mentioned women at all. Another factor which is not mentioned very often in AIDS research is the pressure on women to conform to traditional sexual roles. That is, despite significant gains made by women during the last few decades, women are still more reluctant to discuss sexual issues like AIDS, condom use, previous sexual partners with men, and they're less likely to be assertive during sexual relations and to demand safe sex. So to recap, the construction of AIDS as a gay male disease has left other groups with a sort of false sense of security, and this has led to increasing transmission in rates of HIV/AIDS in those populations and makes it very difficult to get the disease under control in those populations. The other consequence of the initial construction of AIDS as a gay disease that I want to talk about is increased social tensions between gay, lesbian, and bisexual and straight communities. The treatment of people with AIDS has angered many gays and lesbians and has revitalized the fight for gay and lesbian rights. And we can see this coming to fruition now as lots of the marriage equality laws are coming into effect and being changed. Unlike the 1970s and the early gay and lesbian rights movement, AIDS has given a sense of urgency to the struggle. And organizations like ACT UP and Queer Nation have grown out of these feelings of frustration and anger over HIV/AIDS being pegged as a gay male disease, and also anger over the sort of lack of funding and lack of attention to the disease early on that ultimately resulted in lots of unnecessary deaths. And so this has led gay, lesbian, and bisexual individuals to sometimes militantly demand their rights. However, as gays and lesbians have come out of the closet politically, so have the anti-gay and lesbian activists. And we see this in the media. Gay rights has emerged as an important political issue, and it's crystallized a lot of the far-right movement. And so this has led to increasing political polarization, where you have the gay rights movement and liberals who are supportive of gay rights on one side, and you have conservatives who are not supportive of gay rights on the other. However, this tension is not only political, because lots of researchers claim that anti-gay and lesbian violence has also increased since the beginning of the AIDS epidemic. As you can see, the products and the knowledge that we create in society can have important effects on our social experience. The fact that AIDS was associated early on with homosexual men has proved enormously consequential in the history of the epidemic so far. It's also clear that these initial constructions are shaping the future of the epidemic by fostering a dangerous sense of distance between heterosexuals and those homosexuals and people with AIDS. Unfortunately, the margin of safety is narrowing, and heterosexual women and minorities are now the fastest growing groups of people with HIV/AIDS.